Under the gold-lit ceilings of Alexandria, a king kissed his sister before the eyes of the gods. The crowd gasped, yet priests lifted their hands in blessing, calling the union divine, not damned. Drums thundered, incense rose, and the marble temple filled with the scent of honey and rot. Ptolemy IV, Philopator, child of divine blood, smiled as he placed the crown upon Arsinoe's trembling head. Their mother, Berenice long dead, was said to whisper through the smoke, blessing the sin she once embodied. The ritual was no wedding, it was resurrection, the rebirth of Isis and Osiris in human form. Outside, the people bowed not from love, but from fear of blasphemy's price in a god-king's realm. Every jewel glimmered like an eye watching, every statue seemed to breathe as the siblings sealed their fate. In that instant, Egypt's throne ceased to be mortal. It became a temple of incest and illusion. The priests chanted of eternity, but behind their words lurked the stench of power's decay. Wine flowed like blood down golden steps, mingling with spilled oil and whispered envy. Slaves hid their faces, nobles forced smiles, their hearts tight with horror and fascination. Ptolemy believed love between kin was the purest act, untainted by mortal desire. He spoke of divine lineage, of flesh made sacred through repetition of ancestral sin. In private, he sought the ghost of his mother in every touch, every breath, every gaze. His court became a labyrinth of devotion, madness, and slow moral disintegration. Servants carried perfumes to mask the smell of excess, but nothing could hide the rot within. Feasts turned into orgies of worship. Dancers moved like serpents, their bodies painted in gold and blood. Each night the king demanded new spectacles, sacred plays reenacting his own forbidden loves. He watched as actors playing his mother and sister died on stage, only to rise again divine. The audience applauded, yet none dared meet his eyes, for his gaze promised both favor and ruin. Rumors spread through Alexandria's taverns that the Nile itself recoiled from his touch. Old priests whispered that Egypt's gods had turned away, ashamed of their living imitators. But Ptolemy called himself the manifest god, the living bridge between desire and divinity. He built temples not for faith, but for adoration of his own corrupted image. In his mind, love and worship were the same, both demanded surrender, both ended in destruction. The marriage was only the beginning. The kingdom itself would soon kneel before his delusions. For when a man believes himself a god, even incest becomes an act of holiness. And when holiness is born of madness, empire becomes a stage for divine decay. By night's end, the torches dimmed, the drums fell silent, and the crowd dispersed in uneasy awe. Only the siblings remained before the idols, alone, trembling, and bound by a love older than sin. The air thickened with heat and prophecy, as if Egypt itself held its breath. Ptolemy smiled, unaware that in making himself a god, he had already become a ghost. The scandal began quietly, like a whisper in the marble corridors of Alexandria. A priest of Serapis was found strangled in his chambers, his tongue blackened, his hands clutching a royal seal. Rumor spread that he had dared to question the king's holy union, calling it an abomination before the gods. By dawn, his body had vanished, and every witness swore it had never existed. That same night, Ptolemy appeared at the temple of Isis with Arsinoe beside him, dressed in gold so bright it burned the eyes. Before the assembled court, they declared their souls merged as one divine being, two bodies, one god. The priests bowed in trembling obedience, but their chants carried the tone of despair. From that night onward, the Nile became their stage and faith their theatre. Ships, adorned with lotus petals, sailed downriver bearing images of the royal pair locked in embrace. Musicians sang hymns to the sacred siblings, comparing their passion to that of heaven itself. The people watched in awe and disgust, trapped between worship and revulsion. It was said that those who mocked the union were dragged into the royal crypts and never seen again. Meanwhile, Arsinoe's womb became the obsession of the realm. Ptolemy believed their child would be the true heir of gods, the proof of eternal lineage. He commissioned astrologers to predict the divine birth, promising temples and sacrifices if their prophecy came true. But the stars refused him. They foretold ruin, not renewal. Consumed by paranoia, Ptolemy ordered the execution of every astrologer who dared speak of downfall. Soon, blood replaced incense as the scent of his court. Ministers turned on one another, each accused of heresy or betrayal. His mother's image, once sacred, was desecrated in his own festivals. He dressed slaves as queens and priests as prophets, forcing them to reenact her life and death in grotesque pantomime. At one such feast, he appeared wearing her crown, weeping and laughing as he toasted to her eternal beauty. "Behold," he cried, "the gods walk among you, and they are of one blood." The court applauded, terrified, as he kissed his sister before 100 burning lamps. In that moment, Egypt's mask of civilization cracked. Behind the golden ritual, there was only madness, power, and incest disguised as worship. Even Rome's envoys recoiled, sending secret reports home that the pharaoh of the Greeks had become a monster. But Ptolemy did not care for foreign judgment. He lived for the eyes of the gods he invented. He began to build a colossal temple to his own divinity, larger than any shrine to Isis or Osiris. Inside, statues of himself and Arsinoe stood locked in eternal embrace, their marble lips inches apart. Inscriptions declared them the brother saviors of the world. And yet, beneath that blinding facade, his enemies gathered in silence. Arsinoe herself began to fear the thing her brother had become. Her love, once half divine, had turned to dread. Every touch from him now felt like a curse. She saw in his eyes the reflection of her own imprisonment, an empire chained to madness. Even his generals whispered that the gods had abandoned their king, but Ptolemy's faith in himself was absolute, and faith, when corrupted, becomes the cruelest weapon of all. For soon, that weapon would turn against everyone he claimed to love. Intrigue became the new currency of the Ptolemaic court, where loyalty was measured in whispers and betrayal in survival. Behind jeweled doors and perfumed curtains, plots formed like mold beneath gold. Arsinoe's gentle fear transformed into resolve. She began to see that the only way to save Egypt was to destroy her brother. Her ladies-in-waiting, once spies for Ptolemy, now whispered secret oaths in her chambers by lamplight. Even the eunuchs, who had seen too much, turned their loyalty to the queen they pitied. Outside the palace, generals spoke in coded messages, their voices trembling beneath the shadow of divine tyranny. They feared their god-king more than foreign enemies. Ptolemy's reign had become a carnival of vice, where wine, flesh, and worship blurred into political theatre. He appointed lovers as generals, priests as ministers, and poets as judges of the people. The once proud institutions of Egypt became puppets dangling from silken threads of desire. Court banquets turned into tests of obedience, each guest forced to praise his sister wife or risk the lash. He watched for hesitation as though it were heresy. A single pause before applause could mean exile, or worse, inclusion in his next sacred performance. At one feast, he forced his courtiers to kneel before a statue of his mother and kiss its feet. Those who hesitated were dragged into the garden and strangled. Beneath the scent of jasmine, Ptolemy called it purification, Arsinoe called it blasphemy. Her hatred for him grew silently, like rot under the marble of a temple. She began to meet secretly with a commander named Theogenes, a man whose faith in Egypt outweighed his fear of kings. He had seen soldiers starve while the royal couple fed gold to the priests. He had seen temples drained to fund Ptolemy's orgies of devotion. Together, Arsinoe and Theogenes conspired to end the god-king's charade. Their plan was simple: isolate him during one of his nightly rituals and seize the throne in the name of Egypt. But nothing in Alexandria remained secret for long. Ptolemy's spies moved like shadows, their loyalty bought in pleasure and blood. He soon learned of Arsinoe's rebellion, though he pretended ignorance, savoring the delicious venom of betrayal. He prepared a grand festival to honor the gods of the dead, a stage upon which to unveil his vengeance. As the crowds gathered, he dressed Arsinoe in white, calling her the bride of Osiris. The audience cheered, unaware that the play was real, that the queen was meant to die before their eyes. Yet before the dagger could strike, Theogenes burst onto the dais, sword in hand, cutting through guards as if fate guided him. The temple erupted into chaos, priests screamed, torches fell, and the statues seemed to watch with cold amusement. Ptolemy fled through secret corridors, laughing as he ran, blood splattering his robes. Theogenes and Arsinoe escaped that night, rallying the army stationed in the delta. The empire trembled as two gods of the same blood declared war upon one another, brother against sister, husband against wife, god against goddess. The Nile ran red again, not with ritual sacrifice, but with civil war. Each side called itself divine, each claimed the blessing of heaven. For in the Ptolemaic world, even rebellion was painted as prophecy, and as soldiers marched beneath the burning sun, Egypt itself seemed to cry out from beneath the weight of its cursed throne. While gods made war in palaces, the streets of Egypt groaned under the weight of their blasphemy. For common people, life had become theatre, every prayer, every offering, performed beneath the eyes of divine madness. The temples no longer spoke of virtue or mercy, they preached pleasure, purity of blood, and the holiness of obedience. Priests blessed children in the names of incestuous kings, and the Nile festivals turned into orgies of worship. Peasants whispered that the river had lost its soul, its floods less generous each year. They blamed the corruption of the royal bed for the famine that followed. Merchants sold statues of the sacred siblings, half in reverence, half in fear. Mothers taught their daughters silence, warning them that beauty near a palace was a curse. The slave markets thrived, not for labor, but for spectacle. Men and women were bought to play the roles of gods in royal ceremonies, sacrificed to lust, disguised as faith. In the Great Library, scholars debated whether the Ptolemies were mortals or monsters. Some wrote in coded scrolls, calling them the desecrated pharaohs. Others destroyed their own writings, terrified of offending the throne. Even the gods seemed uncertain. Temple statues cracked, idols toppled during storms. The people murmured that the heavens were rebelling, that Ra himself refused to shine upon the cursed dynasty. At night, Alexandria's harbour glowed not with torches of trade, but with fires of rebellion. The sacred processions, once holy, became grotesque parades of painted bodies and hollow hymns. The priests of Isis wore gold masks shaped like the queen's face. The priests of Osiris bore the king's drunken likeness. Faith itself had become parody. Yet still, the people bowed. They bowed because survival required worship. Even when worship felt like sin, in taverns, men whispered that the old gods of the desert were returning. Anubis, Seth, spirits of vengeance long forgotten. Superstition spread faster than rebellion. Omens were seen in every drought, every stillborn child, every eclipse. Farmers refused to plough on the king's feast days, fearing divine wrath. Women wore veils not for modesty, but to hide from royal eyes. In the brothels, painted courtesans sang hymns to the twin deities of desire, their words soaked in irony. For them, divinity had become just another name for power without consequence. And yet, among the despair, a strange resilience survived. Ordinary Egyptians continued to light lamps for their ancestors, whispering prayers the gods had forgotten. In mud huts far from the palaces, love remained human, fragile, mortal, unblessed by the throne. The contrast between the divine incest of the court and the starving simplicity of the villages became unbearable. A fisherman, watching his child die of hunger, spat toward Alexandria and cursed the golden incestuous gods. He was arrested before dawn. His wife was ordered to praise Ptolemy's divinity in the marketplace to prove her loyalty. She did so, voice trembling, eyes hollow, as soldiers watched for hesitation. For in that world, truth was treason and worship was survival. Egypt had become a theatre of fear, and the actors no longer knew their roles. Even the pyramids seemed to lean in sorrow, their stones heavy with centuries of divine decay. The turning point came not with prophecy, but with blood. The war between the divine siblings raged for months, consuming the delta and drowning Egypt in its own myth. Cities burned under banners bearing both their names, each claiming divine right, each invoking the same gods. The Nile became a graveyard, its banks littered with bodies that once bowed in worship. Ptolemy's soldiers fought with fanatic devotion, believing death in his name meant immortality. But Arsinoe's army fought with desperation, driven not by faith but by the hunger to be free. In the midst of battle, thunder shook the horizon. Nature itself seemed disgusted by the blood of its rulers. Ptolemy, drunk on his own divinity, led the charge at Raphia, dressed in gold armor that gleamed like the sun. He called himself Horus Incarnate, the Falcon King, chosen of Ra, but behind him marched an army half-starved, broken by years of indulgent tyranny. Arsinoe stood across the plain, her hair unbound, her armor simple, her eyes burning with defiance. For the first time, Egypt saw two gods who bled like mortals. When the battle began, it was chaos. Dust and screams swallowed the desert air. Elephants roared, spears shattered, and the divine illusion of immortality began to fracture. Ptolemy fought not with skill, but with madness, slashing wildly, laughing as arrows struck his men. He shouted to the heavens, demanding the gods reveal which side they favored. The sky answered only with silence. When his chariot overturned, the soldiers hesitated. None dared lift their god from the dust. In that moment, his mask of divinity cracked. Arsinoe's forces advanced, chanting her name, proclaiming her the true protector of Egypt. For a fleeting hour, it seemed justice might finally prevail. But Ptolemy's luck was as cruel as his reign. A desert wind rose, blinding her army, scattering formations like leaves across the dunes. Ptolemy's generals seized the chaos and turned it into slaughter. Thousands died screaming beneath the indifferent sun, and Arsinoe was taken prisoner. She was brought before her brother husband in chains, her once golden crown now a ring of iron. He wept when he saw her, not out of love, but out of envy for her courage. She had become the one thing he could never be, human. Ptolemy embraced her gently, whispering that her death would make her immortal beside him. She spat in his face and called him a false god, a desecrated son of Egypt. For a moment he trembled, then smiled with divine calm. That night, Arsinoe was strangled with a priest's linen, her body placed in a tomb beside their mother's. Ptolemy ordered her death to be celebrated as a divine union, claiming her spirit had merged into his own. In the following weeks, his sanity began to disintegrate completely. He spent nights in the temple, speaking to statues, caressing cold marble as if it were living flesh. He commanded musicians to play funeral hymns while he feasted, calling it the music of eternity. His reflection in the palace mirrors terrified him. He saw not a god, but a corpse wearing a crown. The people stopped cheering in the streets. Even his priests began to avert their eyes. The Nile failed to flood that year. The city stank of rot and incense, the air thick with the silence of a civilization that had lost its soul. And so, in the shadow of his own delusion, Ptolemy's kingdom began to rot faster than his body. The god king had won every battle except the one against himself. When the madness of Ptolemy IV finally burned itself out, it left behind a kingdom drowning in silence. He ruled a few more years after Arsinoe's death, but he no longer lived. He wandered the corridors like a ghost, haunting his own divinity. The once great empire of the Nile had become a hollow shrine to incest, fear, and forgotten gods. Even his most loyal priests had begun to whisper that the divine flame had gone out of his bloodline. The court chroniclers, once his worshippers, quietly erased his name from sacred hymns. In Alexandria, the people spoke of him not as a pharaoh, but as a curse. The statues built in his likeness were found decapitated, their marble eyes gouged out by trembling hands. The temples stood abandoned, their gold stripped away to feed a starving nation. Egypt, once the jewel of the ancient world, was now fractured, weakened, and ripe for foreign hunger. The Seleucids advanced from the east, Rome watched from afar, and the gods remained silent. The dynasty that had declared itself divine now decayed in mortal shame. Ptolemy's decrees, preserved on stone, were still read aloud, but only as warnings of hubris. Even his allies turned on him. The generals who once bathed in his luxury now conspired against the corpse of his authority. His final days were pitiful. He locked himself in his palace, surrounded by idols of Arsinoe and Berenice, speaking to them as if they still breathed. He believed their spirits answered him through the flicker of oil lamps and the creak of the floor. He dined with their statues, offering them wine and figs as his empire starved beyond the walls. When death came, it was neither glorious nor divine. Some said he was poisoned by his own courtiers. Others claimed he drank himself into oblivion. But the truth mattered little. Egypt exhaled when he finally stopped breathing. His corpse was paraded through the streets. As both a god and a warning, the people did not cheer. They watched in silence. As the golden coffin passed, each man and woman secretly praying the gods would never again walk among them. In death, he achieved what he had sought in life. He became immortal, but only in infamy. Historians would later call him Philopator, lover of his father, but the name carried irony, not honor. His reign marked the irreversible decline of the Ptolemies, setting the stage for centuries of decay and foreign rule. The myth of divine kingship had died with him, replaced by a lesson carved deep into the bones of Egypt. No man can crown himself a god without crucifying his own humanity. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover temples he built, their walls covered in strange hieroglyphs, half prayers, half confessions, and among them, one chilling inscription stood apart. The gods are born through suffering. Perhaps Ptolemy wrote it himself, in a moment of clarity before madness consumed him entirely. For in his story lies the oldest truth of empire. When power worships itself, all that remains is ruin disguised as glory.